The main content I will talk about today are part of my PhD work at Scripps and also some of my ongoing work at NCAR. So the main collaborator here is involved Bree Stevens from NCAR, Matt Long from Seaworthy, and Ralph Key and Eric Morgan from Scripps. I want to start with showing that in Earth system models, it is really hard to simulate seasonal ALC carbon flux. The left figure here shows a series of seasonal flux estimates from CMF5 model. The spaghetti plots, clearly show there are really large model spreads. Models do not agree with the phase and the magnitude. And the dashed line gives you an estimate from Takahashi 2009, and the solid line gives you an estimate from inversion, which both do not agree with each other and do not agree with models. One reason it is hard to estimate the seasonal carbon flux is because the net outgassing is determined by two components that counteract each other on the seasonal timescale. So the right figure here shows the flux component if we separate the net flux in blue into a thermal component in red and a non-thermal component in green. So thermal is the change in C-surface temperature that drive the uptake and outgassing due to solubility change. And the non-thermal component is the residual term that is driven by both the surface ocean biological activities and the vertical mixing of nutrients, which can also be referred to as a ventilation signal. Because net flux is largely canceled out by these two competing effects, a small perturbation in either component will change the net flux a lot. For example, a 10% change in the non-thermal component could result in a 50% change in the net flux. And also the non-thermal part is more uncertain and hard to quantify. The left figure comes from John et al. 2014, shows the decomposition of PCO2 changes observed in the drag passage and using a series of CMF5 model. I just want to know that the figure here shows the PCO2 rather than the flux. And you can see the thermal component is relatively consistent between different models, while the non-thermal component has a way larger spread in models. So this suggests probably we still lack a good understanding of the biological activities and the vertical mixing that drive the PCO2 change and the corresponding ALC carbon flux. So in addition to model and the surface ocean measurements, we could also learn the seasonal CO2 flux from using only atmospheric observation, but there is also a challenge. So the figure here shows the long-term CO2 measurements at 3 southern hemisphere stations in the middle to high latitudes, Cape Graham on top, Palmer Station in the middle, and the South Pole at the bottom here. So you can see there is a really small seasonal cycle. The cycle here is the ocean signal, but it is just very small. So to relate this observed seasonal cycle to seasonal flux is complicated because the atmosphere observation actually mixes the ocean information with other signals. If you also look at another two stations in the low latitude northern hemisphere, you can see a way larger seasonal cycle. And this cycle is not driven by the seasonal ocean flux, but it is almost entirely driven by the land ecosystem photosynthesis and respiration. The land signal on a seasonal timescale is way larger than the ocean signal, and the northern hemisphere land signal goes into the high southern latitudes through a large-scale tracer transport in the free troposphere, which further complicates interpreting the observed seasonal cycle in the southern hemisphere to explain what's happening in the ocean on a seasonal timescale. So I'm not saying we cannot really learn seasonal ocean flux from atmospheric data. What I really want to emphasize is that we need to understand the large-scale tracer transport to precisely estimate the seasonal ALC flux over the Southern Ocean. The conventional method to estimate CO2 flux from atmospheric data is called Bayesian inversion modeling. So this is a statistic method starts with a prior flux estimates, which are initial assumptions about the distribution of CO2 sources and sinks. Then the atmospheric measurements are combined with atmospheric transport models and meteorology data that provide you the surface footprint of your observation to identify the required change in your assumed sources and sinks region magnitude to make simulated tracer concentration better align with your observation. So using this information, the model keep adjusting the prior flux estimate to minimize a cost function, then to refine the estimates of CO2 flux distribution. So inverse products also show a large spread in their posterior flux estimates. The figure here shows the spread in CO2 inversion, and this figure comes from Medlong's 2021 science paper. This paper has a lot of information. So if you just don't look at the 4 PCO2 products, which are products with a more outgassing on the top, you can see inversion, they agree with the seasonal cycle, but they differ a lot on the magnitude of the uptake, especially in the austral summer. So the inversion system could be limited by a lot of factors, including the bias in transport models. It could be limited by how you allow the system to adjust your prior and your assumption to attribute the flux into different sections. So there is also aggregation error in the inversion because we only have very sparse surface station measurements over the ocean. In my recent PNAS paper published early this year, I analyzed four of the inversion systems used in long study. And if you just look at the y-axis in the right figure, what I showed here is that the simulated CO2 distribution at the mid-latitude southern hemisphere during the summer in these models, they do not align with observation. So the matrix I was looking at is CO2 gradient across isentrope in the atmosphere. So the bias in CO2 distribution in models is mainly caused by the bias in tracer transport models used in this inversion system. And the bias in models lead to also the bias in inverted flux over the Southern Ocean, especially in the austral summer. So because the atmospheric signal of the ocean carbon flux is very small, it is small compared to the land signal. So to get the flux right using only atmospheric data, we really need to understand the tracer distribution right and understand the large-scale tracer transport right. And I will show one attempt later in my talk. Another independent way to constrain seasonal ALC carbon exchange is by looking at atmospheric oxygen change. So the ocean is taking up and releasing carbon dioxide as well as oxygen. On the seasonal scale, the ALC oxygen and the carbon exchange are not fully coupled, but coupled in some ways. In this schematic, I try to separate the ocean. I try to separate the oxygen and carbon exchange processing into 3 components. So for the thermal change, oxygen solubility decrease during uptake of heat in the summertime. So there is oxygen outgassing together with carbon outgassing. Biological activities, photosynthesis would lead to increase in dissolved oxygen, but decrease in PCO2 in the summer, which correspond to the opposite direction of the oxygen CO2 exchange across the LC interface. Ventilation signal is also opposite because the deep ocean is depleted in oxygen, but rich in dissolved carbon. So overall, the seasonal non-thermal part of oxygen flux goes to the opposite direction compared to the carbon flux. So the thermal and the non-thermal effect would actually reinforce the net oxygen outgassing. So as you can see from the right figure here, which I decompose the net oxygen flux into a thermal part and a non-thermal part, the 2 processes here together lead to a more pronounced seasonal oxygen flux, and which is mainly driven by the non-thermal component. This also means simulating the net oxygen flux is easier, and it is not very sensitive to the small perturbation in either the thermal or non-thermal component. But a small perturbation in one component would be have a very large impact on the net carbon flux. Another thing I want to mention is the ALC carbon flux is not that coupled with PCO2 biologic activities because the flux is actually buffered by the carbonate chemistry. So CO2 react with carbonate and bicarbonate in ocean. So the chemistry here acts as a buffer system to slow down the net CO2 ALC exchange due to changes in PCO2. But oxygen does not have such carbonate chemistry as buffer system. The dissolved oxygen will collaborate between the surface ocean and atmosphere really fast. It means the production of oxygen in the oceans through photosynthesis will lead to a very rapid outgassing into the atmosphere. So this process does not necessarily require CO2 uptake because of the carbonate chemistry. So ALC oxygen flux can be a better tracer to really study the ocean metabolic activities. The oxygen flux cycle in the high latitude is mainly just driven by the photosynthesis without distortion from the carbonate chemistry. And also because the thermal and the non-thermal exchange cancel out the oxygen flux, but reinforce the oxygen, cancel out the carbon flux, but reinforce the oxygen flux. So combining net LC oxygen and CO2 flux help to better understand how these two processes driving ocean CO2 uptake and to understand whether the LC carbon flux is dominated by the thermal or non-thermal process. But if you really think careful, you will realize there's another complication here. So atmospheric oxygen change is also a function of land biosphere productivity and the fossil fuel CO2 burning. Fossil fuel burning do not really contribute to the seasonal cycle because it only the fossil fuel consumption only has a very small seasonal cycle. But the land biosphere processes do have a larger seasonal cycle. Photosynthesis would release oxygen in the summer and the respiration take up oxygen in the winter. So if you just look at the seasonal oxygen change in the atmosphere, you don't really know what's coming from the ocean and what's coming from the land. This is where we need a new tracer called atmospheric potential oxygen, APO. APO is defined as the combination of oxygen-nitrogen ratio and the CO2 with a 1.1 factor here. So oxygen in the atmosphere is measured as oxygen-nitrogen ratio. APO is mainly a tracer of LC oxygen flux and the fossil fuel CO2 emission. Over the land biosphere, exchange of oxygen and CO2 during photosynthesis and respiration has a ratio of about 1.1. So this combination here would effectively cancel out the impact of land biosphere to the variation of APO. The exchange ratio for fossil fuel combustion is a little bit higher at about 1.4. So APO still has a fossil fuel burning signal, but over the seasonal cycle, the change of APO is mainly due to ocean processes. The left figure here shows a simulation of atmospheric APO together with three components. So you can see the APO seasonal change is dominated by LC oxygen flux, and it is slightly smaller in magnitude because the nitrogen flux cancel out some of the amplitude here. And so you could use APO or LC APO flux to approximate the LC oxygen flux on the seasonal timescale. Oxygen-nitrogen ratio has been measured at a series of stations within the Scripps network, mainly along the Pacific. The right figure here shows a long-term time series of measurements. You can see the oxygen-nitrogen ratio is decreasing over time because fossil fuel burning consume oxygen. But the observed decreasing is actually slower than what expected from simply just fossil fuel emission. Because the ocean is degassing, it is releasing oxygen into the atmosphere because the ocean is getting warmer and warmer, so the solubility decreases. The seasonal cycle you observed here is a combination of land processes and ocean processes. But to only get the ocean seasonal signal, you need to combine the oxygen and the CO2 measurements together. So here is an example of time series of APO at the two stations. One northern hemisphere station alert in black and one southern hemisphere station Cape Graham in red here. You can see the two cycles here have very different phase because of phase shift of oxygen flux between two hemispheres. The seasonal cycle here really tells you the ALC oxygen flux cycle, and it is a good tracer of the ocean metabolic activities. I said that's probably enough for the introduction, and I hope we are all on the same page now. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to show what we can learn about the Southern Ocean ALC carbon flux from measurement of oxygen and CO2 in the atmosphere. So I will focus on three topics. The first is to use oxygen and CO2 measurement from different platforms to show that the high latitude flux cycle is driven mainly by the non-thermal process. So we've learned from PCO2 measurements that non-thermal process dominates the cycle approximately south of 40 degrees south. And I will show the sparse atmosphere measurements also agree with ocean data. And second, I will show how I can derive the Southern Ocean carbon and oxygen flux from airborne data. So I could resolve flux cycle of multiple latitude bands to really looking into the finer scale feature which was considered impossible with sparse airborne data. These estimates can be used for constraint on flux estimates derived from surface station measurements, and could also tell us the latitudinal change of the thermal and the non-thermal processes of the Southern Ocean. Last, I will talk about the carbon uptake on the global scale and on the annual scale. I will show how to use APO tracer as independent constraint to quantify the annual mean ocean carbon uptake. The uptake has been quantified using airborne data and using station data. The result is consistent with other estimates as reported in the global carbon budget. The station data could also provide a constraint on the long-term change of carbon uptake because we have observation for more than 3 decades right now. So I will use observation from surface stations, from ships, and from aircraft. I want to know that the ship measurement here is actually the atmospheric measurement along the ship rather than the ocean measurement. And I will show this data, but I want to just emphasize the main advantage of using atmospheric measurement. So first, the station data provides long-term measurement spanning decades, so it offers an internal consistent system for examining long-term changes. So this atmospheric measurement is very precise and calibrated in the lab. The other thing is atmospheric data also take advantage of the large integral power of the atmosphere, which really tells you the large-scale flux feature. The right figure here shows the surface influence to a series of airborne measurements of the Drake passage here. The black dots are where we have atmospheric sample in the free troposphere, and the red color here shows you the surface footprint to these measurements if you run back trajectory for 7 days. So you can see the measurement over the Drake passage really integrates flux signal over a very large zonal band over the Southern Ocean by a week. So atmospheric data provides an advantage for estimating large-scale net flux feature. The ocean surface is heterogeneous, making the representative sampling in the interior ocean difficult, but the atmospheric data is not very sensitive to small-scale feature, but it really integrates a large-scale feature over a big zonal band. And also the flux estimates from the atmospheric data is not sensitive to the uncertainty in the gas exchange parameterization, because what's changing in the atmosphere really tells you what the total net flux. But the surface ocean data could give us more detailed information of what's going on in the ocean, which cannot be achieved by just using atmospheric data. So I want to first show the observation at 2 Southern Hemisphere stations, Palmer Station and the South Pole. These 2 data provide one evidence from the atmosphere that the air's CO2 flux is driven by a non-thermal signal. So the left figure here shows you the CO2 gradient between Palmer Station and the South Pole, and it is calculated as Palmer Station minus South Pole. So each point here is the transient monthly mean gradient, and the spread gives you the interannual variability. The red line connects multiple year average for each month, and you can see a negative gradient in the Austral summer, December, January, and February. It suggests a lower CO2 concentration at Palmer Station, which is a signal of strong ocean carbon uptake in the summer. Now I also put the oxygen gradient here. So you can see the oxygen gradient has a 180-degree phase shift. The gradient peaks in December, January, February, showing a higher oxygen concentration at Palmer Station. So this clearly suggests the biological activities dominate the CO2 exchange over the Southern Ocean, and the biology-driven uptake in the Austral summer leading to a lower carbon, a lower CO2 at Palmer Station, but a higher oxygen at Palmer Station. So in the right figure here, I also put oxygen gradient on the y-axis and CO2 gradient on the x-axis. So you can see a clear correlation between the oxygen gradient and CO2 gradient. The O2-CO2 ratio is a function of months. It's pretty consistent. It stands on a pretty linear line. And you can see the maximum photosynthesis in the ocean in January here, which give you the most positive oxygen but negative CO2, and also the strongest respiration signal in July, which you have the most negative oxygen but positive CO2. You can also learn this information from atmospheric measurements collected on ship. So the data I'm going to show next is measurement collected on NSF Go. We have both CO2 and oxygen instrument deployed on the ship, and it has extensive measurements over the Drake passage here. The figure here shows you the time series of oxygen CO2 measurement from the ship and also at the Palmer Station. Ship data is marked as the circle, green for oxygen and red for carbon dioxide. And the Palmer Station data is triangle, also green for oxygen, but blue for carbon dioxide. You can see the shape measurement is consistent with the polymer station flex measurement. And you can see the seasonal cycle in shape oxygen anti-correlates with shape CO2 measurement. It suggests a clear biological effect over the drag passage here. The shape data also allow us to look closely on the latitude change over the drag passage here. The left figure shows the seasonal amplitude of oxygen-nitrogen ratio and the CO2 seasonal cycle is a function of latitude from 53 degree to 65 degree. You can see it shows clear meridional feature. Oxygen amplitude is generally increasing with latitude, and the CO2 is a little bit complicated because it also has impact coming from the land when you're really getting close into the to the South America. But combining oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2 allow us to really resolve the latitudinal change of APO seasonal amplitude, which tell us the magnitude of ocean metabolic activities within this 10-degree narrow band of drag passage. So you can see the APO amplitude increasing with latitude, suggesting a stronger biological activities in the higher latitude. We also show the amplitude at the polymer station here, which gives you a smaller amplitude than what we observe from the ship data. So these differences is mainly because the location of polymer station is dominated by the easterly wind, which means it is really sampling air coming from the glacier and ice sheet. So the ocean signal is somehow get diluted out at polymer station. But the ship data mainly gives you the local ocean signal and is a good reference for the ocean metabolic activities. We could also look at ocean carbon flux using aircraft data. So in this space, I will really show how to resolve flux from airborne data rather than just looking at the tracer concentration change in the atmosphere. So I have resolved ALC carbon flux over 3 latitude bands over the Southern Ocean. The paper was published early this year in PNAS. I'm working on Stevens on applying the same measure to estimate ALC APO flux over the same region. We mainly use airborne data from 3 campaigns. The first campaign is HIPPO, and it took place during 2009 to 2011. It consists of 5 campaigns, mainly along the Pacific. I also show the vertical coverage on the right. You can see there is a lot of up and down. We have extensive sampling at different pressure level in the atmosphere, goes from the boundary layer to above tropopause. The second airborne campaign is called AUKUS. So AUKUS is more regional focus. It spans 6 weeks in 2016 summer, and it has pretty good coverage around Drake Passage. And also you can see there is pretty good vertical coverage also from the boundary layer to above tropopause. The third the airborne campaign is called ATOM. During 2016 to 2018, ATOM has 4 campaigns. So not like HIPPO, ATOM has a Pacific Transect and also an Atlantic Transect. It has similar coverage as vertical coverage is HIPPO and AUKUS, but it has more tracer observation here. The figure here is just I merged all the horizontal fly track into one figure here. So we from these 3 campaigns we have sample in all months except December. So it's good enough for us to resolve a seasonal cycle average over multiple years, but can be limited by interannual variability a little bit. So looking closer at the flight data, what I show here is the latitude pressure cross-section of the trended CO2. So basically, we just group sparse airborne observation into each latitude and pressure box, and then detrain the data. Each panel here is 1 airborne campaign transect. These panels are organized by season from January to November. We don't have data in December right now. So you can see there is clear seasonal cycle, especially in the northern hemisphere. But the changes in the seasonal changes in the southern hemisphere is a little bit muted here, right? I just want to zoom into 2 panels, one in austral summer, which is ATOM to Pacific, and another one is in austral winter, which is HIPPO 5 southbound. So the figure here show APO on the left, oxygen in the middle, and the carbon dioxide on the right. So you can see clear APO and oxygen seasonal changes in the southern hemisphere, but the CO2 seasonal change is quite small. So the question here is, how we can resolve flux from these sparse atmospheric measurements. So I want to start with talking about LC carbon flux calculated by this airborne data. So although the seasonal signal is very small, I could still resolve a seasonal flux cycle. As I mentioned earlier, we really need to understand the large-scale carbon transport in order to have a reasonable flux estimates. So in the introduction, I showed that transport models have problems in general. And in my PNS paper, I provide a new method to quantify the mixing rate in the atmosphere, which would facilitate calculating flux from atmospheric data. So the method does not rely on models to quantify transport, but rather using mixing matrix learned from reanalysis. And I want to briefly talk about the method just in a few sentences. So as I'm talking to the oceanographers here, I think the easiest way to describe the method is to start with what we know about the ocean. So as I say, the key for the atmosphere model is to get the large-scale tracer transport right. The idea translated into the ocean language is to do a budget analysis when your box is counted by isopycnal. So the tracer transport in and out of the box is largely determined by the cross-isopycnal diffusive mixing. In atmosphere, we have something similar to isopycnal, which is called isentrope or moist isentrope zeta E. So this is conserved energy surface. We know that tracer mixing along zeta E is really fast. The transport pathway is called adiabatic transport because it does not involve gain loss of energy. So adiabatic transport is way rapid than diabatic transport, which is transport across moist isentrope. The diabatic transport is driven by radiative cooling and is rate limited. So we could also draw a box model. In this case, the observed tracer inventory change within the atmosphere box counted by zeta E should equal to the combination of diabatic transport and the surface fluxes. So the diabatic transport could be simplified as a diffusion system, which means the transport can be learned from tracer gradient across zeta E and a diabatic mixing rate. So I can get mixing rate from transport model, but I'm not going to use this mixing rate, but rather I would use mixing rate, where I parameterize from more static energy budget of reanalysis. So in the PNS paper, I showed this mixing rate from reanalysis are more realistic. We can observe changes in CO2 abundance in each box. We know the CO2 gradient across isentrope from airborne data. So we know the diabatic mixing rate, which is parameterized from reanalysis. So we can directly resolve the surface flux. So I'm not going to expand on the transport term, but just want to jump to the result of the flux estimate. And I actually resolved the seasonal flux for these three bands as I illustrated here. The figure here shows the resolved flux of three latitude bands, and these three bands from left to right should approximate the contoured regions from high to mid latitudes, as shown in the schematic on the right. The x-axis is the month centered on the austral summer, December, January, February. The y-axis provides the magnitude of fluxes, with negative value is net ocean uptake. So each point here are resolved flux from each airborne campaign transect, and the black lines here are two harmonic fits to individual flux estimate its points. So it's clear we can resolve well-defined seasonal cycle in each band. We can see there is a clear changes of the seasonal cycle from the high latitude to the mid latitude, suggesting changing of dominant mechanism that drive the surface ocean seasonal PCO2 variability. In the high latitude band, you can see the seasonal flux is mostly determined by the ocean productivity. You see a strong CO2 uptake in the summer due to photosynthesis, and in the winter, you can see there is a weak outgassing signal. So this feature is related to the ventilation processes that bring CO2-rich water from deep ocean to the surface ocean near the Antarctic. This feature is seen in ocean PCO2 database product, but it's the first time we can resolve such small-scale feature from the atmospheric data. In the mid latitude, you can see the cycle is about anti-phase compared to the cycle in the high latitude. And in this band, the cycle is mostly driven by thermal-induced solubility change, which is anti-phase to the biological productivity change. These transitions are also supported by the surface ocean PCO2 data. And one advantage of my study here is I can really resolve these meridional changes with sparse airborne data, which is not achieved by the previous studies. In addition, if you integrate the first two bands, the annual uptake from my estimate is about 0.36 petagram carbon per year. This is consistent with what we learned in CO2 inversion and what we learned from the PCO2 estimate. So this number is actually smaller than the other estimate from Matt Lang's science paper, which use the same data but different methods. So despite there is a small differences in the spatial domain, this study is only focusing on south of 45 degrees south, but my study is countered by another atmospheric coordinate. So the main difference between my estimate and Lang's estimate is because we treat the atmospheric transport in a different way. Their study was using a series of models to formulate emerging constraints, where I was using only mixing matrix derived from real analysis, which I believe is more realistic. So with the same airborne data, I can also resolve the ALC oxygen flux, which I show below. But this is actually expressed as the APO flux rather than oxygen flux. So comparing CO2 flux and APO flux provide another constraint on the thermal and non-thermal process in the Southern Ocean. The figure below is the same as in the upper, but for the ALC APO flux, I'm using the unit as telemole per day rather than petagram carbon per year. So if I convert the unit from telemole per day to petagram carbon per year, you would see the amplitude will be at least 5 times larger in APO flux compared to CO2 flux. There are many two important messages here. First is over the high latitude in panel A, you can see the APO flux anti-correlate with the carbon flux. And it's also true for panel B. So this also confirm non-thermal process dominate the carbon flux. But in the mid latitude, you would see the APO flux cycle highly correlates with the carbon flux cycle, suggesting the dominance of the thermal process. Another thing that you can see for each region, the APO cycle is always slightly leads in phase relative to the carbon flux cycle by about 2 to 3 weeks. And you can see the seasonal peak here is earlier than the seasonal trough here. And also for the panel C, the peak here is also slightly earlier in APO flux compared to the carbon flux. So this might relate to the fact that the LC carbon flux is buffered by the carbonate chemistry, while the oxygen equilibration is much more rapid. I want to take a step back to compare my carbon flux estimates with what's resolved from SOCAT and SOCOM from Landshuther. The figure here shows a comparison. This might be a little bit busy. You could just focus on 2 green lines, which is the SOCAT estimate and the SOCOM estimate. And you can see our estimates generally agree with SOCAT in all these 3 bands, but suggest a smaller outgassing in the highest latitude compared to the SOCOM data. So I also put the SOCOM version I use here because I was also advised there might be other versions that I should use for comparison. So it will be interesting to understand the differences between SOCAT and SOCOM, and also the differences between the airborne estimates and the SOCOM estimates. So for the APO flux, I also compared with one ocean observation product, GoBy. So GoBy is a machine learning interpolation of the ocean dissolved oxygen measurements. I calculated the LC oxygen flux from the dissolved oxygen in GoBy using the Bushinsky method, which includes both the diffusive flux and the bubble flux. And I used the high resolution wind from CCMP. So the net APO flux also requires a small correction from the ALC carbon flux and ALC nitrogen flux, which I used one configuration of CSM. But these two correction is just very small. So I put the GoBy flux cycle in blue. I couldn't resolve a flux in the highest latitude because GoBy is missing data further in the ice zone. So, but at least in the mid latitude here, you would see the GoBy agree with our airborne observation, and in the mid latitude here, but here it agrees also good, but clearly show a later phase and a later transition from the oxygen outgassing to oxygen uptake. So both carbon and oxygen flux estimates really illustrate that we can compare atmospheric measurements with ocean measurements. And the result flux estimates from two types of data could constrain each other for understanding large-scale processes. So in the last part, I want to show how we use atmospheric oxygen measurements to provide independent constraint on the annual global ocean carbon uptake. The result we inferred from oxygen data are consistent with other approaches reported in the latest global carbon budget. So we observe APO decreasing in the atmosphere. Below is a schematic explaining what processes leading to the observed APO change. So APO is decreased is mainly because of the oxygen consumption during the fossil fuel CO2 burning. And there are other three ocean contributions here. One is the outgassing of oxygen into the atmosphere due to the ocean heat uptake. The second is the uptake of anthropogenic CO2, which is what we want to calculate. The third is oxygen outgassing due to an increase in the primary production due to the nutrients through anthropogenic aerosol deposition, and this is a very small term. And recently, Battle et al. Also introduced another term called ZMAT. ZMAT is an oxygen source to the atmosphere that accounts for the small fraction of fossil fuel oxidation during the refining of metal over the land. This is also a very small correction. So we can observe the oxygen APU decrease in the atmosphere. We can quantify the fossil fuel burning impact. I learned the ZMAT term from Battle. I learned the deposition term from model. And for the APO climate term, it is scaled from the ocean heat content, which leave the APOC anthropogenic as the residual, and this is the can tell us the ocean carbon uptake from oxygen observation. So with all this information, the annual uptake I reported in my early GBC paper last year using only HIPPO and ATOM airborne data was 2.7 plus minus 0.25 petagram carbon per year. And this does not have the ZMAT term before. If I incorporate this term, I can revise the number to 2.9 plus minus 0.28 petagram carbon per year. I want to mention Eric Morgan is working on a similar estimate to use long-term station data to quantify the ocean carbon uptake using atmospheric oxygen measurement. So we have station data for more than 3 decades, so he can really resolve the uptake for 3 decades, which I showed in the table here. So this table comes from the recent global carbon budget, and these estimates use slightly different parameter as I use for my GBC paper, which should provide a large uptake compared to my original calculation. So with his parameter, I can revise my estimate to 3.4 plus minus 0.35 petagram carbon per year. And this is very consistent with what we learned from the station data. This table also shows annual uptake estimates from other methods. My estimate is consistent with the FCO2 method, slightly larger than the global ocean biogeochemistry model, and it is consistent with the inversion and Earth system model. So oxygen measurement is also a useful tool for constraining the annual ocean CO2 uptake, both on the decadal average and also on the long-term trend. Just a few takeaway of what I present today. So I showed atmospheric oxygen observation. So for the first point, I show atmospheric oxygen observation provide complementary information of the ocean carbon cycle. So combining oxygen and CO2 observation really helps us to understand the thermal and the non-thermal processes driving the ALC carbon flux. Oxygen flux could be a better tracer to study the ocean metabolic activities because it is mainly driven by the non-thermal change and because it is not buffered by the carbon chemistry. Oxygen flux is also easy to simulate in models because the thermal and non-thermal part reinforce the oxygen flux cycle, which might be a better matrix to benchmark ocean biogeochemistry model. And I also showed we can use oxygen observation to quantify the ocean carbon uptake independently. For the second point, I show that we can use station data, ship data, and the airborne data to support that the non-thermal process dominate the ALC carbon flux over the highest latitudes. With ship data, we can resolve fine-scale feature showing that within the drag passage, APO system amplitude is increasing with latitude, pointing to a larger ocean productivities near the Antarctic. And with sparse airborne data, I can directly resolve the flux over three latitude bands over the Southern Ocean, showing the dominance of non-thermal process in high southern latitudes shift to be dominated by the thermal processes in the mid-latitude. So this is also confirmed by resolving LC oxygen or APO flux using the same airborne data. For the third point, I showed my LC carbon estimates from three zonal bands over the Southern Ocean is consistent with SOCAT-based estimates and mainly roughly consistent with the SOCOM-based estimates, except in the highest latitude band. So SOCOM seems to have a very large outgassing, which might relate to the bias in pH sensor. And I showed the LC oxygen flux estimates from airborne data is also consistent with what we derived from the go-by data, despite the mid-latitude band seem to have a small phase difference. I show that the annual CO2 uptake derived from oxygen observation is consistent with other estimates, including the PCO2 measurements, Earth system model, and atmospheric inversion. And for the last point, we do need more data. It's true for the both atmosphere and the ocean community. I'm mainly working with airborne data. The advantage of airborne data is that it takes advantage of the large integral power of the atmosphere, and it is really good constraint on large scale feature. So all attempts I did so far is to provide a climatological estimates because we only have limited data which do not allow me to resolve into annual variability or decadal variability. We require more future campaign, but which is something still in the air. But we do have a little bit more data at this point. I want to mention an ongoing project at Escargot, Southern Ocean Carbon Gas Observatory. The goal is to fly from Christchurch to McMurdo and then to South Pole. We had a test flight season in 2022. The campaign last year was canceled. This year is still not decided. The vertical sampling from Escargot is not like the other campaigns. We mainly just have data in the upper troposphere here. But with this limited number of data, we can still resolve carbon flux using method I proposed. So in the same figure, I show what Jesse Vance did with the Escargot data. He updated the Escargot estimates to the estimates in my PNS paper. The Escargot estimates are shown in the purple line here. You can see it is consistent with what I derived from other airborne campaigns. But to really use airborne data to resolve a trend or decadal variability, we need such campaign every year, which doesn't seem to be possible at this point. So we still have a really long way to go. This is all I want to present today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Yiming. That was a really, really nice overview. So are there any questions to get us started off? I guess maybe I can ask one first, which is that so the latitude bands for your air CO2 flux estimate is based on the position of the moist isotopes in your box model, is that correct?
Yes. So
And
it's actually, so you can see the zonal
yeah.
structure here. So it's actually quantified, it's countered by the moist isotope. So what I showed here is just a zonal average, but over the seasonal scale, the variation of this band is very, very small. But there will be larger variability if you're really looking at the synapse scale variability.
Yeah, so then I guess related to that then is, so how do you decide, because this is this is sort of a 4-box model, but like could you get finer resolution by, adding more isotopes? How did you pick the isotopes that you used in the study as your boundaries?
Yes, so if we have extensive data, I can resolve the flux on a even finer resolution. The choice of the Z scale is based on how many data I have, because we don't have like all data at each column at very fine latitude. So I just trying to get an average for each isotope box to have a small to have a more like well-defined tracer concentration. I would say how fine I can get depends on how many data I have. And according to the Hippo Orcas atom spatial coverage, this is probably the best I can do. If I goes into an even finer resolution, you would see there will be an even larger uncertainty related to the spatial bias and the aggregation error. But with a model output, let's say like a forward transport model, I can really reconstruct the model flux on a very fine resolution down to maybe just a 1 out of 10 on the scale as I shown here.
Thanks. It looks like there's a question in the chat from
yeah, I can answer these questions. So inversion-based method require using transport models. One thing I think I can go back to this figure. Sorry. Yeah, so one thing I showed here is inversion underestimates the CO2 gradient in the summer. So this is related to the bias in transport model. A way to think of this is if your transport model bias the mixing too fast, which means more high CO2 air mass get transported into the high southern latitude in the summer, this will lead to a larger uptake by the ocean because inversion is designed to best match with the what we have at the service stations. What I showed in the PNS paper is these inversions all mostly have transport model that have a too fast mixing rate. That's why it can bias the summertime ocean carbon uptake to higher than the other estimates.
Any other questions?
Hi, I can ask a question.
Sure.
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Yuming. Thanks for your talk. It's really nice. Um, one of the things you mentioned at the end there was that we need more data, and that's really difficult. And I suppose it's a huge push to try and get this done, but individual campaigns are difficult to run. Could you speculate a little bit about how we can use this model in the future? Are there other ways at which we can increase the amount of data through this method, or yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts on sort of how we can use this very interesting technique to increase our knowledge about AOC fluxes.
Yeah, so the model I built here is mainly just for interpreting the airborne data to calculate the flux here. So one advantage of my model here is I don't really need to have very extensive coverage of airborne data. So traditionally, you need to have data at different longitude, latitude, and the pressure in order to get a reasonable, like a box average tracer concentration. And what I did is to express the data on isentrope, which is a preferential mixing surface. This actually simplifies a 3D problem to a one-dimension problem. This has implication for strategize the future airborne campaign, which shows all we need is data across different isentrope so that we can use this data to quantify the surface flux either from the ocean or from land with a relatively good position. So what I showed for the escargot campaign is, so Jesse Vance is working on a paper that adapting my method to future airborne campaign so that we can have an easy way, streamlined way to really interpret airborne data in terms of the flux. And this method also does not require you to run a, like, let's say, inversion model, which use the meteorology data and runs on supercomputer, because in my framework, the transport is constrained just by the energy budget of reanalysis. And the energy budget is quite, does not really have large interannual variability, so you don't really need to get it mixed rate every year. It has very small interannual variability. So the method here is providing a pathway forward to interpret this airborne data. And so what I showed here is just oxygen and the CO2. I've also applied this method to other tracers like methane, and I can anticipate this method can be applied to other chemical inert tracer, or even, you know, tracer with chemistry. Depends on whether you're interested in looking at the chemistry in the atmosphere or looking at the surface flux. But we do need more data in order to get more information about what's happening in the future, the long-term trend and the variability.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I see one on the chat.
Yes. So if we can have really precise, or I should say accurate CO2 retrieval, I can feed into my framework to get the flux. But I think this is still a big challenge to the OCO2 and satellite community to really correct their retrieval, right?
So if you wanted to constrain interannual variability using this sort of a box model, like would you need just like one campaign each year, or like how much data do you actually need if you want to constrain interannual variability?
So I would say we still need several flights each year, because one flight might really my sample some scale variability. And I would say if we have flight, let's say from Christchurch to McMurdo or even to the South Pole, maybe every 2 weeks, and we have 6 flights per year, which span like a year and a half, that would be good enough for me to really resolve some interannual variability.
And could you give a sense of how tricky it is to make these observations? Like, are there flights going at the moment that
it's
can be used?
It's
Or,
expensive.
yeah,
It's expensive.
it's expensive. Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, then I guess we can finish there. And thanks so much, Yuming. It was a really nice overview, and it's good to get the atmospheric perspective. So I really appreciated your talk a lot.
Thank you for inviting me.